Okay, well, welcome to this research seminar. This is based on some work I've been doing now for about, 6 months I've been doing this research, because it came out of some module reports from my modules the last couple of years, which showed something interesting. Some of my modules are some of the very few modules in the university where there is no difference in grade profiles and mean mark between what's called the BMEI, Black Minority Ethnic International students, and the white UK students, which is a problem that's causing a lot of heartache around the countryside. And I ended up doing some more detailed work for a chapter of a book I'm writing for Mark Anderson, one of our externals. And so I thought, well, I'll kill several birds with one stone, because Philip Plowden is really keen on some of the work I've been doing, some of the analysis. And it works as part of his workshop program, working party on student achievement, as it's called. And so I've also introduced, well, here's the basic problem. Over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we've had this problem of 10 to 15% gap between the BMEIs and white UK students. And there is more literature that you can shake a stick at, vast amounts of stuff about it. So that's the very broad context. It turns out that there are at least 3 rather interesting questions. One which I picked up from one of our colleagues downstairs on the second floor, whose perspective is actually ethnicity is not a valid indicator or parameter or any longer. It's kind of passé, and it's probably built on the wrong theoretical basis. However, we still have the problem that actually, when we measure it, on a lot of modules, there is a gap. So that sort of sits deep in it, right at the back, and is potentially a problem for this field of achievement. But what I wanted to look at as well, because I've changed my teaching style very, very dramatically over the last 3 years, and so I want to have a look at, does the pedagogic approach have an impact? And is it visible? Can you see it? And does it affect this so-called BMEI white UK deficit? And then behind it as well is another question: are there other aspects which are sort of fundamentally perturbing the way, or causing some of these gaps which we're quite easily able to measure? So I want to address a few, or parts of, these 3 questions. It's not a conclusive really, but it sort of kind of sets some markers in the ground as to where we might want to take our pedagogic research a little bit further in terms of student achievement and teaching styles and pedagogic approaches in general. And the start really was when I started looking at, or producing, end-of-term module reports, particularly 2012, more particularly 13 and 14, using very simple visualization, just using grade vertical bar charts, the most simple sort of visualization you can get. It seemed that there was very, very little difference, if any, between the 2 groups. The interesting thing was that these 3 modules, 3 final year modules particularly, which are post 20 credit modules. What I've done and I'm presenting today is a much more in-depth, more statistically based piece of work. But the kind of background that sensitized me to the situation were these 3 modules. I do other modules, as you know, first year and second year, but these are 3 which were particularly interesting in driving the point, what's happening? Is there something I'm doing? Is there something about the pedagogic approach? what's happening and what actually are the facts when we start looking using t-tests and a few more than simple vertical bar chart type of visualization. See what we can find out about what the numbers tell us. So my research questions that I'm kind of looking at today are, one, in those 3 modules, post 20 credit validation, what is the current level of BMEI achievement in relation or comparison to the white UK students on those 3 modules? The second question was, is it feasible to identify at a statistically significant level that there was a change in achievement either across the whole cohorts or between the 2 sub-cohorts? And looking back further into time, can I see or can we detect a difference in levels of achievement and differential achievement as I change from the classic standard didactic lecture-based type of approach to a much more Socratic approach? By which I mean, in a didactic approach, you're really teaching answers, pretty much. You're standing in front of students and you are telling them these are things that are really, really important, you've got to use, this is how it works, these are the answers effectively. Whereas in a Socratic approach, you don't teach answers, you just teach questions. And in terms of teaching theory as well, the theory of gravitation that Newton discovered when that apple fell on his head, nice simple little formula. In one sense, that is the answer, that if you have 2 bodies like this distance apart, this mass, they will attract at this, whatever the formula says, it's an answer. But you can also teach it in the opposite way around, that formula that Newton created is actually a very interesting question. Because you can then say to students, well, okay, here is the formula, and it appears to work in relation to holding us on the surface of the Earth. It seems to work with satellites and moons going around planets and the Earth and so on going around the Sun. But why is it that if I drop a lead ball, it hits the floor very, very quickly, yet if I drop a feather, I'm almost lucky if the feather gets to the ground in any reasonable amount of time? And so you're saying, okay, what is it that's breaking that normal gravitational acceleration of 32 feet per second squared with a feather? Go find out, folks, the source of experimentation, really. And it turns out that this approach seems to give a different sort of behavior with the students. In those 3 modules those 3 final year modules, the students are learning almost all of the time by research. They have a little bit of introduction in a seminar context, 5, 10, 15 minutes of these are the critical questions in this topic area. Right, go away and do some research. Find some good examples of literature, both in the academic, journal type of literature, but also in the field I'm teaching, those are the 3 subject areas, there's an awful lot of really valuable information from what you might call the professional press. Organisations like TechNet, ZDNet, Computer Weekly, Computing, and many, many other journals published in the professional side rather than the academic side, which actually is much, much more up to date. Because we know that if we write a paper, it's often based on research a year or 2 before, which we then number crunch, we've written a paper, we then put it into a journal, and in the fullness of time, which might be a year, year and a half, it goes through the peer review process and gets into the publication cycle. And some of the stuff that's published today in the IEEE could well have been researched 3, 4, 5 years ago, certainly 2 or 3 years ago at least. Whereas in the professional press, we are seeing stuff that is keeping chief information officers, chief security officers awake at night now. And so they're doing a lot of research in all sorts of interesting areas to find evidence, to find ideas that answer the questions that are set as part of the seminar process. But they're online all the time, they're researching online to get the answers. What I also have done, and our externals are really rather keen on this now, is that I'm bringing in heavy focus on employability so that 20% of their grade for an assignment comes from perfect adherence to formatting and presentation. So if they get perfect presentation and absolutely rubbish everything else, they still get 20%. But the important point is they are using one or two of our different standard templates, whether we use the IEEE template or the Springer LNCS template, both of which are fairly evil and break remarkably easily. And in terms of employability, the justification is they will go out there, and whether they're doing IT or whether they're doing forensics or networks and security or whatever else, they will operate in organizations where they have to present their reports to a particular standard. They will have to change templates from time to time. We have to use 3 or 4 different templates a year, typically ourselves, if we're putting presentations to conferences or papers to IEEE or to Springer, or we're writing chapters of books, and every single publisher has a different template, all of which break horribly easily. And so the purpose here, and the justification for presentation formatting as being worth 20% is, they've got to learn to deal with it, which is why we started this year with the first year in Introductory to Computer Science, that their article was written in the Springer LNCS template, which they hopefully will then be using for the rest of their academic career here. And they're learning in the first semester of their first year, so they kind of get over the deal with it problem quite early. So hopefully we will see much better quality of presentation with their reports year by year. And they will therefore be more employable because they won't end up with reports which have to be bounced by the supervisor at their place of work. This is rubbish, you didn't adhere to our conventions. A third change I made with these 20 credit modules is a formal final draft review to the criteria, the rubrics, with submission through Turnitin, and they come to me on a schedule, and I spend about 10-15 minutes with each one assessing formatively to the criteria their current status. Now typically for the good students that would have been the version they would have submitted, and typically they've got 20, 30, 40% loss of marks in presentation. And there are other things in the academic side that can be improved. Those are all noted in Turnitin, as we normally do for final summative submission. They then go away, and about 4 weeks later, they submitted again the final version for the summative assessment, and again come back, and on a 10-minute cycle roughly, I then give them the marks there and then. We can discuss it, and they're happy, there are no challenges, we can debate whether that was a 45 or a 55 on that criterion. And we have a discussion, they can have a sort of helpful input, and we can decide between us that, yeah, it still is 45, it's not really quite good enough to get to here because you've missed out on this part of the criteria. And as I say, they're marked face to face. So there are 3 things going on in what I've done over the last 2-3 years, which makes it a little bit more difficult to work out whether it's that approach, teaching no answers, only questions, whether it's partly related to that, or whether it's related to this part here. Now, one of the things is that all of this stuff is done in teaching time. I have almost no overhang of marking anything at home, at night, or any other time. It's done in teaching time because, particularly this bit, is part of developing the student skills. So, teaching no answers and frameworks of questions, learning by research, and continuous formative development in the workshops, in the labs, in the seminars. incredibly intensive one-to-one, one-to-two, one-to-three sort of work. There is no essentially formal lecturing at all, except in one or two areas. So it's a rather different way of teaching, and I suppose what underpins all of this is that I do not count myself as a subject expert. I am not the academic who is a fount of all knowledge. I am an academic who teaches skills, who develops the student's skills, whether it's learning, whether it's employability, whether it's research, whether it's writing. They are doing the learning through their research, and I will coach them and help them with those skills. I'm a skills academic, not a subject matter expert. Yeah, of course, I know a fair bit about the subjects I teach, but I expect my students, particularly third year, doing that, to know more than I do, in the end. At least the ones who get first. They have researched in areas I've never thought about. They're coming up with those left field ideas which they can connect to the core of the domain and come up with some really spectacular left field connections which are valuable and interesting and really insightful. I am not intimidated by the fact that students might know more than me in my subject area. I encourage them to do that. I do not have a comfort zone that I know more than they do about governance. I don't need that. But I do know, it would appear, more about helping them to develop their skills and their achievement to the levels that they can really achieve. In other words, I have incredibly high expectations of them. The data sample. I've gone back through all of my spreadsheets that are stashed on there, all nicely protected with hardware encryption. All of the module spreadsheets that I have taught and personally assessed back to 2004. There are gaps in it where I wasn't teaching many of the modules, but essentially there's 7 modules that I've incorporated in levels 4, 5 and 6 with 17 module instances across the years from 2004 to 2013 academic year. I have hand-coded the raw data into whether a student is BMEI or White UK, because you can't, didn't have the time, and in fact the self-identification that we get in the university is not very reliable or very helpful, and it's actually fairly simple to do. There may be 1 or 2 people who, because my memory is not good enough over the last 6-7 years, and I take one example, Adam Taylor, I think it's Adam Taylor, who turned out to be Kenyan nation, and when his father came into the UK, he was asked what his name was, and thought that was a question of what was his profession, so they became Taylor by accident. So there are 1 or 2 that I know out of the total of 800 odd items of data where there may be 1 or 2 slightly miscoded. That can be fixed quite easily, but it's insignificant. And then I use SAS, because that's our new product, which is really quite good for analytics, and I use the means, the free and the t-test procedures to develop a whole lot of data. Simple descriptive stats, the mean marks for the modules, academic years, BMEI, White UK separation. T-test to look at the significance of differences between the mean marks for the various groups. And then I also look, because I realized that if we look at the literature, there are 2 ways of assessing the BMEI deficit compared with White. Either on the mean and standard deviation and the normal descriptors, but also there is a question that for some reason, sometimes we actually end up with different proportions between the 2 groups, even with similar means, but they get slightly different levels of the good honours, the 2, 1 and above. And so I want to have a look at that as well, which is kind of interesting. So, what did I find? Over the years, the red line, or pinky line, is the white UK, the blue line is everybody else, the BMEI group. And you can see how, since 2004, which was a couple of years after I started here, we can see first year, pretty close, big gap there, then it's all fairly similar. And then, since 20 credits, which is there, things have started getting different. I'm looking forward to adding in this year's stuff up here to see what's happened this time. But keep that in your mind for the moment while I then show, I want to show the changing profile. So I'm going to take snapshots at each of those points. And we can see the top one is always the black and BMEI, and this is the white one, the lower one. And I've taken 6 of the 8 years that are on that previous one. And I'm giving you the t-test probability number there, so you can see what level of confidence we have that they are different populations. By eyeballing the profiles, they're pretty close. That's getting a little bit more likely that there are differences in the groups there, which kind of goes, if we go back to the previous one, you know, we can see that something has happened there was something there, but that actually turns out to be not hugely significant. It's reasonable, but not fantastic. And then here, there's one where the PR factor is incredibly low, which means there is a pretty high probability that those are 2 populations, or something happened that made them behave differently. And then back here for 2013 academic year, back to pretty darn close. So that's a way of looking at and showing how the profiles change. Basically, the message there is broadly, with 2 years as exception, the rest of the populations are essentially samples from the same, broadly. So I've pulled out now where there is a little bit of evidence that there may be different samples, different populations. So something different happened there. The good grades one, again, when you are where the mean of the is close to 60, 65, you don't have to change the profile very much, and you suddenly end up with only 20% BMEI getting good grades there, compared with a 50% white at that point. So it's again, small changes in the profile, very, very small changes, produce quite large changes, especially where the mean is very close to that boundary for the good grade achievement. And this sometimes is the factor that is mentioned in some of the academic reporting on this, that sometimes they use the means, sometimes they use the good grade achievement. So that raises a question which, in terms of the pedagogical analysis of student achievement, whether it's this BMEI thing or anything else, any other fact parameter, whether it's male, female perhaps, which I've not looked at yet, you can get occasionally get some quite big differences between the 2 ways of looking at the difference. And we need to think carefully about it. And some people will choose one because it makes their point, some people will choose the other because it makes their point. I produce both because there's an interesting point to debate rather than to provide an answer. Looking at the impact of the change pre-20 credit, either 15 credit approach and the newer 20 credit modules where I've changed in those 3 areas of teaching questions, not answers, changing the assessment profile to take account of presentation, a lot of research based learning, and that formative feedback process. So there's 840 data points in total. 573 for the old didactic approach, 270 students worth of data about using this new one. Mean of the old approach 60% roughly, the mean of the new approach 69%. At that level of confidence of some difference. Kind of interesting. Fairly conclusive, I think. And if you look across the profiles, apart from the fact that SAS is irritating and chooses different bucket sizes for the two graphs, but you can see pretty much the red line is the actual sample itself, whereas the blue line is their view of the normal distribution that might be there. So we can see quite clearly a fundamental difference, that roughly 9 percentage points improvement overall in achievement by this new way of doing things. So, what are the conclusions? Well, first one comes back to that measure. Are we looking at the good grades level, or are we looking at the means anyway, the basic achievement levels? Broadly, in terms of the mean marks, we're seeing that in these set of modules, ethnicity is not a very valuable or useful indicator to assess what's going on. But if we're looking at the good grade measure, then for the earlier years, where the mean is about on the boundary between good and other levels and degrees, that's probably the reason why we've got problems on that one. But we do have a very, very significant change in overall levels of achievement, irrespective of whether there's a difference between BMEI and Whites, UK. But there is that 8%, 9% difference with extremely high confidence levels for the change in approach to teaching. Actually, it's change in approach to letting students learn. Where to next? Well, I want to incorporate the 2014 academic year data to see if it confirms that it's now plateaued roughly at the 70% odd level. I want to crawl back over those modules where I do have all of the data for the final draft review and the summative final mark to see whether it's on the academic aspects or driven by changes there, or whether it's driven by changes in the presentational side, or both. I would like to really extract all of the data we have in the computing scheme for the last 8 years or so. That's a rather more formalised project because I have to get involved with extracting large amounts of data out of PeopleSoft and so on. But it'd be interesting to see how this applies in, or what factors are happening in other modules across the scheme. I would also like to link into the work that Marcello and Dave Voorhis are doing, which is looking at some of the data that come from the applicants at the applicants level to see what's there, whether there's some predictive approaches we can develop based on what their submissions at application, to see whether that links through to their actual achievement, see whether there are better ways of actually filtering our applicants, so that we don't necessarily just get everybody we can at clearing, but we can actually use something from this part of the project to be much more subtle in the offers we make, where we don't necessarily have to change the actual entry tariffs significantly, but we can get more assurance that we are getting people who have the right aptitude for computing and maths type programs. And I think we'll learn a lot. I have no idea what will come out of that part. It will be just interesting to see. It will also be interesting to track students from their first to the second to their third year, to see whether there are differences in achievement between different types in terms of the cognate areas that the modules are covering, to see whether one student is really great at part of the diet of modules, and yet there are other areas which maybe, looking back here, we can see that, yeah, it's obvious they weren't going to do well there. So there's an awful lot of stuff to come out of this learning analytics approach, which I think will be very valuable to help us to get better students, get the right students who will really benefit from what we're able to give them. And maybe we can find out better ways of doing the teaching, the learning and assessment that will help students to achieve their full potential more effectively, rather than something prevents them achieving their full capabilities. One thing that goes into that is that we have, and that was one of the points about the assessment, which I haven't mentioned, is it's absolutely crucial that our rubrics are very carefully constructed. If we use the standard university type one, which says, if I go back a few years, we had satisfactory, see on the pass side, good, very good, and excellent or exceptional, you know, you can't help but essentially mark to a bog standard profile that says the mean is going to be around about 55, 60%. You've got to do that. Part of what I've done here is change the criteria in ways that are much easier to assess. It's very difficult to know what is good at first year, what counts as good at second year, what counts as good at third year. How do I identify someone in a final year module who has done work which is as good as a master's student with a grade, as a merit? Very difficult to cope with that under the good, very good, excellent type of process. But if you've got criteria like, and in the top, these three modules I've used for the final year, the 95% band is publishable in an international journal. The 85% is publishable in a national journal. And we, as academics, by and large, many of us are on journal review panels, editorial panels, and so on, and we get to see and feel and understand what those different criteria are. And the externals like it because it is unarguable. If you've given someone an 85% UK type journal or national journal, yeah, we know what that's like. And we can teach the students and help them to identify on the grounds of, say, novelty is one of the criteria which is actually rather important. And then there is no obvious mechanism for saying you've overmarked, unless you clearly put lots of people in 95% is an international journal, and everybody can argue that and say, well, that's rubbish. They're actually only low-level conference level, which is, say, 65 or 75%, and then maybe you do have to rescale. But if you do it carefully, with experience, you have an unarguable profile. And that's, again, I think, part of the importance of choice of your marking criteria and the way that you implement it. Not a single holistic, which is what we used to do here, but a much more targeted with weightings between 20% for presentation, 40% for topic, and 40% for analysis, perhaps. And you can work that yourself. You can have 3 columns if you want for the topic or the academic side. And that then provides you with much better evidence for getting that good results. Okay, that really is what I want to say. The sort of future over the next year or so, using analytics, using SAS and its various interesting engines to do some of this work for us, to help us understand what actually is going on.